My first ever social work client stands out more than any other. The meeting was to take place in a shady, pay-by-the-hour motel. As I parked my trembling Toyota, 2 police officers outside informed the place was being cased for a prostitution ring. I was to meet a 25-year-old mother to 4 children under the age of 5 who called the motel home. As I entered their teeny tiny bedbug space filled with dirty laundry and sad broken toys strewn about, I observed the mother, fearfully presiding over her babies, all clutching various fragments of the mother's garment, apparently afraid I was there to take them away. In completing a state-mandated safety assessment, the previous investigating social worker found no imminent safety threat. However, the risk of future maltreatment to these children remained high, hence my visit. On county paperwork, the mother was described as non-compliant, as a bipolar, and as a prostitute. The reason this case stands out to me is not because of what I saw, but because of what I was thinking. As I stood there, one forceful question raced through my mind. What was she thinking, giving birth to all these children? And a second quickly followed. What's wrong with her? I imagine many presented with a similar situation might have reacted like I did, with rash judgment and perhaps even contempt. For in today's us versus them cultural mindset, we are experiencing untold amounts of suffering. And while we often chalk up this dynamic to human nature, there is something that accounts for much of it, an overlooked root cause. And that, quite simply, is our propensity for labeling others. To label someone is to call them by a diagnosis or a descriptor of a behavior that somehow challenges our notion of what ideal living should look like. For example, an alcoholic, or schizophrenic, or prostitute. Research shows that when professionals and lay people label others, that label keeps people from asking for and getting the very help they need. Furthermore, provider attitudes based on client labels affect how apt we are to believe our clients' struggles and stories when they share them. Labeling pushes people away into the other, them category, diminishing people as nothing but problems needing to be fixed. But what if they're not problems at all? I once read a case file on a woman who experienced decade-long childhood sexual abuse by a family member. And when she disclosed this abuse to her parents, not only did her parents not believe her, they disowned her. In running away from home into the street, she encountered people who lured her into sex trafficking. Miraculously, about age 17, she somehow escaped, and on a cross-country bus trip toward freedom, she met a man she married 1 month later. What this example shows is that people who suffer childhood trauma may go on to make compromised life choices. Current scientific literature abounds with peer-reviewed studies correlating childhood trauma to later in life struggles, including mental health issues like schizophrenia and addiction. Statistics from a 2014 study show that over 70% of women in prostitution were sexually abused as children. Any person committing acts you or I might label is not doing so because they're inherently bad or broken or even problematic. It is because they have been and might still be being harmed. Yet every human being is comprised of so much more. Our lived experiences and our traumas, yes, but also hopes, dreams, potential, and possibilities. Yet when we label, we limit people to one thing, to one problem with which they might be struggling at one point in time. We view them as the problem, when in reality the problem is the labeling itself. So if labeling people is a problem, what's a solution? Well, you may have heard the term trauma-informed care. which demands of us that before we ask for or expect problematic behaviors to change, we first recognize our role in helping others to feel seen and heard and understood. One trauma-informed way to create healing paths for others is to use person-first language. To first identify the person, and then describe their struggle as a secondary and conditional circumstance. Person-first language is not a new concept. In fact, first introduced into public sphere in 1974 to create a shift in how people with disabilities were viewed, it has since become best practice in my profession. It's mandated by scholarly journals and taught at most health profession programs. And while trauma-informed language is ever evolving, person-first language is a place to start. So instead of using the stigmatizing labels, alcoholic or addict, we can say someone struggling with substance use. Instead of schizophrenic or bipolar, we can say a person diagnosed with a mental health issue. And instead of prostitute, someone has engaged in sex work. Person-first language leaves room for hope of change, recovery, and healing if needed. I first marched into that mother's motel room looking at her through the lens of the labels. Not surprisingly, she refused my help. Before my second visit, my supervisor challenged me, "Lisa, might you let go of the labels? Lean in without judgment, and listen first to understand the mother and her perspective. And then going forward, use only person-first language in all case notes and court reports." As I began shifting my practice, I sensed a profound shift in my attitude as well. And as I leaned in, so did she. Over the course of our relationship, I learned the mother's non-compliance was rooted in fear of me, of the system, of losing her precious progeny, her very inspiration for getting up every day. Her bipolar, a diagnosis given by a psychiatrist her parents hired to quiet her reports of sexual abuse. And her prostitution, how she supported her babies, all conceived during a violent, coercive, and sometimes life-threatening relationship with a man she married 1 month after meeting. Yes, the case file referred to earlier is that of the mother I met in that motel. That prostitute was once an innocent little girl, victimized by sexual abuse, sold into sex trafficking, and was engaged in survival sex when I met her. I initially viewed her as a problem needing to be solved. But when my judgmental question, "What's wrong with you?" shifted to the trauma-informed question, "What happened to you?" this mama found new footing to create safety for her babies and find some measure of healing for her soul. And that is the question I wish someone had asked me back in my days of trial, when at 27, with few resources, a struggling marriage, and lack of higher education, I, too, felt wholly unseen, both in the darkness of my childhood sexual traumas and in my deep, desperate desire to make something other than a mess of my life. For what others saw was me at 18, graduating high school valedictorian, considering a plethora of full scholarships to notable universities. 2 weeks after giving a graduation speech to a standing ovation, I was pregnant. No longer labeled the good girl and most likely to succeed, I encountered new labels. Unwed pregnant teen, girl fallen from grace, a disappointment among others. By fall, I was married off to a man I barely knew. Over the next 7 years, bore 5 children, and for decades, struggled to ask for and get needed help. All the while, begging to be seen, not through another's labels, but through my lens of suffering. We don't need a social work degree to create this shift, nor do we need to adhere to a tremendously complex array of nuanced, hypersensitive actions. Might I invite us to simply start by practicing person-first language? Before we judge, and before we align ourselves with a label ascribed by anyone other than the person in front of us, might we first lean in, listen up, and learn stories honoring self-determined identities before attempting to intervene in any presenting problem? In Viktor Frankl's autobiographical bestseller, A Man's Search for Meaning, he famously states, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space lies both our freedom and power to choose our responses." I contend that childhood trauma takes away that space. And in our healing journeys, we need each other to create it. Will you choose to label, thus perpetuating stigma and furthering harm? Or will you wield your power wisely and choose a response that puts the person before the problem? In seeing the person first, we embody this idea that people are not problems to solve. We are beings begging to be understood. Thank you.